One of the sources that I used for my annotated bibliography was a book called Dying to Eat: Cross-Cultural Perspectives on Food, Death, and the Afterlife. So it was, even after I did all my other sources, it was by far my favorite source that I did. It was a book that mostly focused on American cultures, Chinese cultures, and Mexican cultures. So it didn't quite get at every type of culture, so it's not exactly the broadest, but it really just helped me open my eyes to see, like, there's a lot of different communities in our country alone, and especially like here in Texas and in the South, that we get to see so many different cultures just from people coming. And so it just was a really good book for me to open my eyes and realize that the people next door could be seeing food in this way when they have like death. That kind of opened my eyes a little bit. So I also liked that the author did a lot of her research in Texas, because I was born and raised in Texas, and so I could relate to a lot of what she mentioned, and I was just able to like relate to her a lot, and it just made me be like, oh wow, like okay, yeah, what she saw in Texas for American cultures, what she wrote about, really is like how we do our funerals and what we see food as for our funerals. So, like, a general idea of one of the chapters, because I didn't get to read all of the book, unfortunately, but I did read a big chunk of it just because I thought it was really interesting. And so the chapter that I focused on was about sugar and starches. So that was kind of like it focused a lot on the wine aspect of it, but it also talked about just like your sweeter foods and your casseroles, just because they have a lot of the starch. But then like it brought up like Texas sheet cake, which is something that my family makes, and so I thought that was really cool. But that was kind of like the sugar part of it, and then the wine was both the sugar and the starch. And so here for like American cultures, we don't really necessarily prioritize wine as part of like a ritual for funerals or anything, which I mean, I am not even old enough to drink, so I probably wouldn't know if it was anyway, but I've just never seen that even in my family as I've been growing up. Like, I've never noticed that they have, sat around after we went to the funeral and drank wine. But especially in Chinese cultures, they do, and they do that as a way of kind of remembrance and kind of as a fancy, like get together, in remembrance, and, they see a death as they're going to a new life. And so some religions don't, some religions do, but for the Chinese culture as a general whole, they do see that, and so that's their way of kind of like lifting them up into their new life. And so I thought that was really interesting, because they, like, wine to them is like must have at a funeral, and I don't think we could say the same in America, at least for any of the funerals that I've been to. Another thing I thought was interesting is they talked about how, like, in America, we bring food to families kind of before and after the funeral, so that way they don't have to worry about, cooking as they're trying to grieve, and they don't have to, do this, they can just put it in the microwave with the pre-made casserole that's been in the freezer that someone brought by. So, and like my family does that. When we know someone that's passed away, we make something for them, we prepare something. And when like I had someone in my family pass away, like we had people bring us food. And so it's just something that's really common that happens in, like, again, my personal life. But it's not the same for both Mexican and Chinese cultures, because they use food as less of a like, kind of, I don't want to say celebrating, but celebrating. And they use that as more of a way to, a lot of them do like cooking for the one person who passed away rather for cooking for the family that passed away, is what I was trying to get at. So they focus more on the, giving to the ones who have already passed rather than giving to the families of those who've passed. And so I think that was really interesting as well, because at least what I've seen, we don't usually cook for that person. We might make some of their favorite meals in remembrance of them. Like, my grandma really loved homemade noodles, and so like me and my family would make noodles for her. Like, for us, I guess I just said that, but like we made it for us, but in remembrance of her. But they make food dedicated to that person. So I just thought that was interesting. I think that food is such a different thing to think about when like death, dying, and all of that grieving. And I thought it was a really unique thing to talk about in terms of like why we do the things that we do. Like, because, well, yeah, like my grandma did that, but like where did that come from? And so I think it's interesting to know that like food, when it comes to death, is a cultural thing. It's not necessarily just a like, oh, this is what we decided to do. So that was my kind of thought process, and something I thought was really interesting that I learned while doing my annotated bibliography.